You may have been misled about relationships your entire life because most people are taught to believe that the problem is always external. The wrong people, the wrong words, bad timing, lack of emotional maturity in the other person, circumstances, luck, fate. But Jesus revealed something far more unsettling. He exposed a type of relational bond that does not die when people walk away. It survives distance. It survives silence. It survives time. And it remains alive as an invisible debt. This kind of debt does not merely affect one relationship, it reshapes how you relate to everyone who comes after. Have you ever noticed how certain wounds do not make you cruel, they make you guarded? You do not become a bad person, you become a cautious one. You begin to calculate more, trust less, explain yourself less, expect less, offer less access. And you call this maturity. But there is a cost hidden beneath that protection. You start living in relationships where no one is ever truly close, where connection exists, but intimacy never fully forms, where people can approach you but never quite reach you. Before we go any further, I need to say something clearly. At the end of this teaching, there will be a prayer, not an emotional release, not a ritual, not a moment designed to make you feel lighter for 5 minutes. It will be a prayer of discernment and repositioning. A prayer meant to interrupt relational cycles that feel normal but have been draining your connections for years. Because the most difficult teaching of Jesus is not uncomfortable because it is harsh. It is uncomfortable because it is precise. And it only liberates you once you stop pretending you do not understand it. So think honestly. How many relationships have you lost not because love was absent, but because accumulation was never addressed? Accumulation of silence, accumulation of resentment, accumulation of unmet expectations that were never spoken. Often there was no dramatic betrayal, no singular catastrophic moment. There were daily disappointments left unresolved, minor frustrations repeatedly swallowed, small misinterpretations that no one corrected. And by the time you noticed, a distance had formed that neither person knew how to cross. What makes this especially dangerous is what happens next. Over time, the person no longer says, "I am hurt." They say, "This is just who I am. I'm colder now. I'm more reserved. I don't trust anyone. I prefer to stay to myself." A reaction quietly becomes an identity. And the cycle repeats itself with different people, in different environments, under different circumstances, as if reality itself were validating an old conclusion. No one is reliable. No one understands me. It always ends the same way. This is where the real risk begins, because Jesus never treated repetition as misfortune, he treated it as law. When he said, "A tree is known by its fruit," in Matthew 7:16, he was not speaking merely about religious morality, he was revealing a structural principle. What repeats is being fed. And if the fruit remains consistent, withdrawal, conflict, emotional exhaustion, distrust, then the root is still intact. Most people try to fix relationships using techniques, better communication, therapy, advice, promises, motivational phrases. These tools can help, yes, but Jesus went deeper than tools. He revealed that some relationships do not collapse due to lack of dialogue, but because of something far more subtle, the need to collect emotional payment. This is why the teaching is difficult, because it does not begin with the other person. It begins with you, not in terms of blame, but in terms of governance. It exposes a form of power you may not realize you are using, the power to keep someone in debt. Almost no one admits this. You may say, "I forgave," but your tone reveals that a charge still exists. You may say, "That's in the past," but the moment conflict arises, the past resurfaces as a weapon. You may say, "I don't hold resentment," yet internally there is a silent ledger. Who failed, how much it hurt, how often it happened, who should apologize first. Jesus directly confronted this mechanism when he taught about judgment. Do not judge so that you will not be judged, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Matthew 1:2. This is not a mystical threat. It is a relational law. The measure you apply becomes the environment you inhabit. If you measure people by failure, you will live among people who measure you the same way. If you measure through love, you create a space where love can breathe. This is difficult because it implies that many people live surrounded by the same hardness they project. And now comes the part most people resist. Sometimes, a person is in difficult relationships because they always encounter broken people. They are in difficult relationships because they have become someone who only knows how to connect through control, defense, and emotional accounting. This is not condemnation, it is diagnosis. And Jesus was a master diagnostician. He was never impressed by spiritual appearance. He observed hearts and fruit. This is why he said something deceptively simple but surgically precise. In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Matthew 7:12. Most read this as moral advice. In practice, it is relational engineering. You do not harvest reconciliation while living in attack mode. You do not harvest trust while operating in suspicion. You do not harvest lightness while functioning through constant demand. And here lies the hidden retention breaker for many lives. If you continue interpreting relationships exclusively through the behavior of others, you will never see the pattern repeating within you. You will change partners, environments, communities, but carry the same internal system. You will call repetition destiny. Jesus addressed this with unsettling practicality. Instead of saying, the other must change first, he said, first go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Matthew 5, verses 23 to 24. This reverses the order entirely. He does not begin with ritual, image, or spirituality. He begins with relationships. In other words, a spiritual life without reconciliation becomes performance. But Jesus also did not romanticize peace. He exposed false peace. He taught correction, but correction without poison. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Matthew 18, verse 5. He did not teach gossip disguised as prayer. He taught clean confrontation. This is rare because it requires maturity, speaking to the person, not about the person. But we are still not at the core teaching. The most difficult teaching of Jesus about relationships emerges when Peter asks a question every human has asked internally. Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Matthew 18, verse 21. Peter is not being cruel. He is being human. He wants a limit, a number, a point where he can finally say, now I am justified in giving up. Jesus' response dismantles that entire framework. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Matthew 18, verse 22. Many stop there, but Jesus did not. He immediately told a parable, and it is in this parable that the revelation most people avoid. Because Jesus was not teaching kindness, he was teaching debt. A servant is forgiven an unpayable debt. Then he encounters someone who owes him a small amount, and he seizes him by the throat, demanding payment. Matthew 18, verses 28 to 29. That image is physical. He chokes him. This is how emotional debt works. You do not discuss, you tighten pressure. You do not reconcile, you demand. You do not restore, you extract. And now you begin to see why this teaching is so difficult. Jesus is exposing a contradiction many live with unconsciously. They want mercy for themselves and rigid justice for others. They want understanding but do not extend it. They want forgiveness but ration it. They want second chances but deny them. This does not only damage relationships, it hardens the soul. Jesus ends with a sentence many prefer to ignore. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Matthew 18, verse 35. This is not intimidation, it is awakening. Forgiveness is not social etiquette, it is a spiritual mechanism. Without it, the person remains locked in an invisible prison. And this must be said with precision. Forgiveness is not denying pain. Forgiveness is relinquishing the right to collect payment. That is why it is difficult, because the human mind wants compensation. If not through apology, then through guilt. If not through guilt, then through suffering. If not through suffering, then through distance. But payment in some form must occur. Jesus taught that this demand masquerades as justice, but functions as poison. Modern neuroscience now observes what Jesus articulated centuries ago. When a person repeatedly replays offense, the brain reactivates stress circuits as if the event were occurring again. Cortisol rises, sleep degrades, irritability increases. The body remains imprisoned in a past that has already passed. Jesus understood this when he taught that unforgiveness binds and burdens. Solomon articulated the same principle with clarity. A person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19, verse 11. Glory, not weakness, because forgiveness requires a level of internal dominion the ego cannot sustain. And this raises the question that determines whether you change or repeat. How do you forgive without becoming a doormat? How do you release debt without enabling abuse? How do you obey Jesus without self-destruction? This is where most people collapse into extremes. Either they harden and withdraw, or they become permissive and are wounded again. Jesus taught neither extreme, and this is precisely what almost no one notices. There is a path of forgiveness that is not naive, and there is a boundary that is not hatred. But this cannot be delivered all at once, because this distinction between forgiveness, reconciliation, and access is the mechanism that reorganizes everything you think you understand about relationships. If you miss the distinction between forgiveness, reconciliation, and access, you will spend your life oscillating between two destructive positions. You will either become emotionally rigid and proud or endlessly permissive and wounded. Most people alternate between these extremes and call it growth. Jesus taught neither. This is where many sincere people damage their lives while believing they're obeying God. They forgive, but without discernment. They reconcile without truth. They grant access without change. And when the cycle collapses again, they conclude that forgiveness doesn't work, boundaries are unloving, or that Jesus' teaching is unrealistic. The failure is not in the teaching, it is in the confusion of categories. Let us define them with precision. Forgiveness is an internal decision. It is the deliberate renunciation of the right to demand repayment. It frees the other person from your internal courtroom and releases you from the prison of constant judgment. Jesus did not romanticize this. He presented it as a spiritual key. When you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone. Mark 11, verse 25. Notice the language. He ties forgiveness not to emotion, but to flow. Unforgiveness blocks movement, not because God is petty, but because resentment occupies the space where clarity should exist. Reconciliation is different. Reconciliation is relational restoration. It requires truth, accountability, repentance, and oftentimes it is bilateral. Jesus valued reconciliation deeply, but he never treated it as automatic or imaginary. In Matthew 18, he outlines a process: confrontation, response, witnesses if necessary. That is not sentimentality, that is structure. Reconciliation requires reality, not desire. Access is something else entirely. Access is proximity, influence, intimacy. It is the level of entry someone has into your emotional, mental, and practical life. And here lies the critical error. Many people believe that forgiveness obligates reconciliation, and reconciliation obligates full access. Jesus never taught this. Forgiveness is liberation. Reconciliation is restoration. Access is administration. Jesus administered access constantly. The Gospel of John states something that disturbs many readers if they slow down long enough to notice it. Jesus did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people. This sentence is not peripheral, it is central. Jesus loved people. Jesus served people. Jesus forgave people. But he did not indiscriminately entrust himself to people. He knew who they were. This dismantles a dangerous myth that love requires blind trust. Jesus was not naive, he was discerning. This matters because many cycles repeat for one simple reason. Forgiveness was real, but access was restored without transformation. The person was practicing avoidance, not wisdom. They were trying to preserve peace, not cultivate health. Jesus never taught false peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, Matthew 5:9. A peacemaker does not avoid conflict. A peacemaker creates conditions where peace can exist, and peace almost always requires uncomfortable truth. Now consider the practical implications. You can forgive someone and still establish boundaries. That is not bitterness, that is governance. Scripture calls this wisdom. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. Guarding the heart is not emotional closure, it is relational administration. It is deciding what enters, what remains, and what does not. Many people confuse guarding with shutting down. They withdraw entirely, call it self-respect, and wonder why loneliness follows. Others confuse openness with virtue, tolerate disrespect, and wonder why resentment accumulates. Jesus did neither. He practiced mercy with intelligence. This brings us to a subtle but critical dynamic that traps many people in repetition. Why do some relationships replay the same pattern after forgiveness and new beginnings? Because forgiveness occurred without discernment and access was granted without evidence of change. This is not the way of Jesus. It is the way of fear of conflict, fear of being alone, fear of appearing unloving. Jesus did not avoid fear by appeasing it. He confronted it with truth. Now we must address another misunderstanding that quietly destroys relationships while appearing spiritual. Many people tolerate unhealthy dynamics because they confuse endurance with virtue. They endure disrespect to avoid abandonment. They absorb dishonesty to maintain connection. They accept emotional crumbs to avoid emptiness. And they call this kindness. Jesus would not call this kindness. He would call it blindness. When lawlessness increases, the love of many will grow cold. Matthew 24:12. This is often applied to society at large, but it also operates within relationships. When injustice repeats, love freezes. The heart does not disappear, it retreats for survival. People then say, "I'm not the same anymore." No, you lost boundaries and your nervous system entered defense. But here is where the teaching becomes even more difficult. The hardest instruction of Jesus is not simply to forgive, but to forgive from the heart without becoming submissive or controlling. This requires a rare skill, separating the event from the meaning. Modern psychology describes this in technical language. The human brain creates narratives to protect identity. When someone hurts you, the injury is not only behavioral, it becomes interpretive. I am not valued. I am replaceable. I am unsafe. You begin reacting not to what happened, but to what it meant. Then you fight for validation. You demand proof. You attempt to make the other person pay for the wound. Jesus taught a different path. He anchored identity in God, not in relational feedback. That is why he didn't need to win arguments to exist. He didn't need to perform strength. He simply was. Here is a crucial insight most people miss. When you do not know who you are, you use relationships as identity sources. Any threat to the relationship becomes a threat to self, and fear produces control, withdrawal, manipulation, or over-sacrifice. Not because the person is evil, because they are desperate. Jesus did not teach relationships as emotional prosthetics. He taught them as expressions of a governed heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:39. This is not romantic language, it is diagnostic. If you despise yourself, love becomes dependency. If you abandon yourself, love becomes negotiation. If you lack internal governance, relationships become battlegrounds.
And now comes a truth that challenges almost everyone. Sometimes you aren't arguing with the person in front of you. You are collecting payment for a debt created long before them. An old betrayal, an early abandonment, a past humiliation. The present relationship becomes the courtroom for a historical trial. Jesus addressed this as spiritual blindness. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own? Matthew 7:3. This is not an insult. It is a diagnosis.
The log is a lens, a filter, an interpretive structure that distorts perception. This is why Jesus used the word hypocrite so often, not as an insult, but in its original sense, actor. Someone responding to one scene while performing another. Present body, past battle. This explains why communication alone rarely solves relational breakdown. If conversation were sufficient, your patterns would already be gone. Communication helps, but it does not dissolve invisible debt. Here is the partial revelation many accept too easily. We just need to talk better. No. The deeper issue is this. The hardest teaching of Jesus is the renunciation of emotional collection, paired with the courage to establish truth and limits. But one piece is still missing. Even if someone forgives, even if they reconcile, even if they promise change, what prevents the mind from reopening the ledger during the next conflict? What stops the heart from resurrecting the invisible spreadsheet? Jesus gave an answer most people ignore because it appears overly simple. He spoke about words, about clarity, about agreements. Jesus understood that relationships are not sustained by feelings, but by structure. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from evil. Matthew 5:37. Most read this as speech etiquette. It is not. It is relational law. When words lack clarity, relationships produce confusion. When yes is unstable, expectations collapse. When no is indirect, resentment grows. A life filled with maybes, we'll see, someday, and I didn't mean it that way becomes an environment where nothing is safe. Anxiety fills the space where trust should live. This teaching is difficult because it demands emotional responsibility. It requires truth before accumulation becomes poison. It forbids silence as punishment. It exposes politeness as camouflage. Jesus knew that many relationships collapse under two forces that seem small but are lethal: vague promises and absent boundaries. Where boundaries are missing, debt forms. Where promises are vague, disappointment multiplies. The human mind tries to stabilize this by collecting emotional payment, and the tribunal returns. This is why Jesus did not say, "Endure quietly." He gave a method. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Matthew 18:15. This is relational hygiene. It prevents triangulation. It prevents resentment from forming parallel relationships in the shadows. When you do not speak to the person and instead speak about the person, you create a secondary relationship, the relationship with resentment. And that relationship grows until it dominates the real one. Psychology observes the same pattern. Unresolved conflict keeps the nervous system in alert mode and replaces response. The amygdala dominates. Interpretation becomes aggressive. Tone escalates. Patience shortens. Then the person concludes, "I have a bad temperament." Often it is not temperament. It is sustained relational threat. Jesus addressed this long before neuroscience existed. He taught reconciliation before ritual because he understood that unresolved relational tension becomes chronic noise, and chronic noise becomes exhaustion. Now we reach the turning point. The most difficult teaching of Jesus about relationships is not forgiveness alone and not confrontation alone. It is sustaining a heart that does not collect debt and a truth that does not manipulate. This is rare. Most people confront to dominate. Most people forgive to feel superior. Most people set boundaries to punish. Jesus did none of these. When he set boundaries, it was for truth, not revenge. When he withdrew, it was discernment, not contempt. When he forgave, it was liberation, not weakness. Consider how Jesus responded to false accusations. He did not defend himself compulsively. He did not chase validation. He did not perform outrage. This was not passivity, it was governance. He understood that healthy relationships are not built on desperation for approval. Blessed are the meek. Meekness is not fragility. It is strength under control. Control protects relationships. So the question that determines your relational future is not, how do I make the other change? It is, what system am I sustaining with my words, reactions, and measures? Sarcasm produces warfare. Silence produces distance. Guilt produces temporary compliance and long-term resentment. Accusation produces defense. Emotional manipulation produces insecurity. Jesus taught a higher path, speaking the truth in love. Ephesians 4:15. Truth without love becomes violence. Love without truth becomes permissiveness. Jesus carried both. Here is the overlooked detail that transforms everything. Healthy relationships are not built by repeatedly forgiving offenses. They are built by creating an environment where offense stops being the primary language. This requires clarity, limits, and responsibility. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. This is not about tone, it is about atmosphere. Some words disarm, some words ignite. Jesus mastered this. He knew when to speak, when to remain silent, when to confront, when to leave. Now you can see why this teaching is so difficult. It depends less on how others treat you and more on who you decide to be when they do not. You can leave with a beautiful idea about forgiveness, or you can leave with a structural shift. Stop living in a courtroom. Start living in covenant governed by truth. And now the final piece approaches, the mechanism that prevents the cycle from restarting. Jesus taught that hearts change environments when people change the standards of truth they tolerate and the words they permit themselves to use. Relationships are governed by invisible agreements. Those agreements are formed, maintained, and broken through language. Most people believe relationships fall apart because of feelings. Love faded, passion disappeared, chemistry changed. But Jesus never treated emotion as the foundation of relational stability. He treated words, truth, and alignment as the load-bearing structure. This is why his teachings repeatedly return to speech, vows, promises, and clarity. Not because language is polite, but because language creates environment. What you tolerate in words becomes the law of your relationships. Jesus understood something the modern mind often resists. Relationships are not sustained by intention, but by agreements. And agreements do not live in emotion, they live in language. This is why unresolved relationships feel heavy even when nothing bad is happening. The weight comes from invisible contracts that were never clarified, renegotiated, or closed. You can feel this instinctively. When someone says, "We'll talk about it later," and later never comes. When someone says, "I'm fine," but their body says otherwise. When someone says, "Do whatever you want," but punishes you afterward. These are not emotional problems, they are contractual ones. Jesus confronted this directly when he said, "Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from evil." This statement sounds simple, almost naive, but Jesus was not talking about vocabulary. He was revealing a relational law. Ambiguity breeds anxiety. Inconsistency breeds distrust. Vagueness breeds resentment. When words do not match reality, the nervous system stays alert. The relationship never settles. People become hypervigilant, scanning tone, reading subtext, anticipating shifts. This is not closeness, this is survival. Many people live in relationships where nothing terrible happens, yet everything feels tense. The reason is not lack of affection, it is lack of clarity.
Jesus knew that where clarity is absent, people compensate through control, guilt, withdrawal, or emotional accounting. This brings us to a crucial distinction. There is a difference between peace and silence. Silence can be used as punishment. Peace cannot. Silence can be used to avoid truth. Peace requires truth. Jesus did not confuse the two. He consistently confronted situations where people avoided clarity under the guise of righteousness. Now consider how this applies practically. Most recurring relational conflicts are not about the content of the disagreement. They are about undefined expectations. Someone assumed availability that was never promised. Someone expected loyalty that was never discussed. Someone anticipated change that was never agreed upon. When expectations are unspoken, disappointment feels like betrayal, and the mind reacts by reopening the ledger. You should have known. I shouldn't have to say this. If you cared, you would understand. These are not emotional problems, they are contractual ones. Jesus confronted this directly when he said, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone." Notice what he did not say. He did not say, "Hint until they understand." He did not say, "Withdraw until they notice." He did not say, "Complain to others until you feel validated." He said, "Go, speak, clarify." This is relational hygiene. Without it, resentment becomes the primary relationship and the actual relationship becomes secondary. Modern psychology describes this as emotional triangulation. Jesus addressed it centuries earlier. Now we must examine why clarity feels so threatening to many people. Because clarity risks loss. When you speak clearly, the other person may disagree, they may resist, they may leave. Ambiguity feels safer because it preserves illusion. But illusion is expensive. It costs energy, it costs peace, it costs authenticity. Jesus never preserved relationships through illusion. He preserved integrity, even when relationships ended. This is why many people misinterpret his actions. They see his firmness and call it harshness. They see his boundaries and call them cold. They see his truthfulness and call it unloving. But Jesus never used truth to dominate. He used it to define reality. Here is a pattern that traps many people. They forgive internally, but never renegotiate the agreement, so the same violation repeats. They reconcile emotionally, but never redefine expectations, so disappointment returns. They restore access without addressing language, so confusion multiplies. Forgiveness without renegotiation creates cycles. Jesus understood that relationships cannot heal without new agreements. This is why he spoke so often about covenants. A covenant is not a feeling, it is a defined relational structure. Marriage, friendship, discipleship, all are covenantal in nature. They are sustained by shared understanding, not emotional momentum. This is why Jesus warned against careless promises. He knew that broken words produce unstable environments. When you make a vow, do not delay to fulfill it. This is not about religious duty, it is about relational integrity. Now consider how many relationships operate today. People promise presence they cannot sustain. They promise change they haven't embodied. They promise openness they are afraid to maintain. Then, when reality exposes the gap, resentment forms. Not because someone lied maliciously, but because someone spoke without governance. Jesus' insistence on yes and no was an insistence on responsibility. A clear no protects relationships more than a dishonest yes. Most people say yes to avoid conflict and pay later through resentment.
Jesus never paid relationships with resentment. He paid with truth up front. Now we must confront another difficult reality. Many people believe forgiveness alone should dissolve tension, but forgiveness does not dissolve confusion. Only clarity does. You can forgive someone completely and still live in relational chaos if expectations remain undefined. This is why Jesus did not only teach forgiveness, he taught confrontation, boundaries, and explicit instruction. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, Luke 9:23. This denial is not self-hatred, it is ego restraint. It is the refusal to manipulate relationships for emotional safety. Here is the deeper mechanism. When people lack clarity, they rely on interpretation. Interpretation breeds projection. You begin guessing motives, reading tone, assuming intention, and interpretation is rarely generous under stress. This is why unresolved relationships feel unpredictable. Predictability does not come from affection, it comes from alignment. Jesus aligned expectations constantly. He told his disciples exactly what following him would cost. He did not promise comfort. He did not promise ease. He promised truth, and many walked away. He let them. This reveals something critical. Jesus valued truth over retention. He did not trap people through obligation. He released them through clarity. This is why so many relationships today feel manipulative. People stay not because they are aligned, but because leaving feels dangerous. Fear is not a relational glue that produces health. Now we must address a subtle but destructive habit, using spirituality to avoid truth. People say, "I'm praying about it," when they mean, "I don't want to talk." They say, "I'm giving it to God," when they mean, "I don't want to confront." They say, "God knows my heart," when they mean, "I don't want to explain myself." Jesus never used God as an excuse to avoid relational responsibility. He taught reconciliation before sacrifice, truth before ritual. This is why unresolved relationships sabotage spiritual life, not because God withholds, but because clarity is blocked. Now let us examine the internal mechanism that keeps people reopening the ledger. The human brain seeks coherence. When words and actions do not align, the brain attempts to reconcile the gap. It either justifies or accuses. Justification numbs, accusation hardens. Neither heals. Clarity heals. Jesus' teaching on speech is fundamentally about coherence. What you say must match what you intend. What you promise must match what you deliver. What you tolerate must match what you value. When these align, relationships stabilize. This leads us to another uncomfortable truth. Many people secretly benefit from ambiguity. Ambiguity allows escape. It allows deniability. It allows control without accountability. Jesus called this darkness. Everyone who does evil hates the light. John 3:20. Light is not cruelty. Light is exposure. Exposure is uncomfortable because it removes leverage. This is why clarity feels dangerous to manipulative systems. Now we must return to the central issue. Why do people reopen emotional debts even after forgiveness? Because forgiveness was not paired with a redefinition of language. They forgave the offense but kept the same conversational patterns. Sarcasm remained, silence remained, aggression remained, vagueness remained, and these patterns recreate the environment that produced the offense. Jesus addressed this by teaching a different way of speaking, not louder, not softer, clearer. Now we approach a pivotal insight. You do not change relationships by feeling differently. You change them by speaking differently. Speech creates boundaries. Speech defines expectations. Speech establishes safety. This is why Jesus said, "Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." Matthew 12:34. He was not condemning speech, he was diagnosing environment. Words reveal the system governing the heart,
and systems produce outcomes. So now we arrive at the threshold of the final transformation. The most difficult teaching of Jesus is not just forgiveness, not just boundaries, not just clarity. It is the sustained practice of truth without aggression and mercy without manipulation. This requires internal authority, authority over impulse, authority over fear, authority over the need to be liked. Jesus demonstrated this consistently. He could be gentle without being weak. He could be firm without being cruel. He could withdraw without punishing. This is not personality. This is governance. And governance changes everything. In the next part, we will dismantle the illusion that healthy relationships require constant emotional availability, and we will expose the difference between availability, presence, and access. This distinction is what breaks generational cycles. It is what prevents forgiveness from becoming self-betrayal. It is what allows love to exist without fear. And it is the final architecture Jesus modeled, not with theory, but with his life. One of the most destructive misunderstandings in modern relationships is the belief that love requires constant availability. That if you care, you must always be reachable, always responsive, always open, always accommodating. Jesus never taught this. In fact, he modeled the opposite. He was present without being consumed, available without being controlled, loving without being invaded. And this distinction between availability, presence, and access is one of the most critical relational architectures Jesus demonstrated, even though most people never consciously notice it. Availability is logistical, presence is intentional, access is authoritative. Most people collapse all three into one vague idea called being there.
And when these categories blur, relationships become unstable. Let us define them precisely. Availability refers to time, attention, and responsiveness. It answers the question, can I reach you? Presence refers to engagement and focus. It answers the question, when you are here, are you actually here? Access refers to influence and proximity. It answers the question, how much of you do I get to affect? Jesus managed all three deliberately. He was not always available. He was not constantly present. He never gave unlimited access. Yet no one loved more completely than he did. This alone should dismantle the cultural myth that love equals constant emotional exposure. Consider how often Jesus withdrew. He left crowds. He disappeared after miracles. He went to solitary places. He refused to answer certain questions. This was not avoidance, it was governance. He did not let urgency dictate intimacy. Many people confuse urgency with importance. Just because someone demands attention does not mean they deserve access. Jesus never allowed emotional pressure to override discernment. This matters because many relational wounds come not from what was done, but from what was allowed. People say, I keep getting hurt, without realizing they keep granting access without evaluation. Now we must address a painful truth. Some people do not want relationship, they want regulation. They want access to soothe their anxiety, validate their worth, or stabilize their identity. And when access is denied, they interpret it as rejection. Jesus did not manage relationships around other people's insecurity. He managed them around truth. This is why he could love deeply and still disappoint expectations. Now observe how this applies to forgiveness. Many people forgive, but then feel obligated to restore full availability, full presence, and full access immediately. When this fails, they conclude forgiveness is dangerous. The danger was not forgiveness. The danger was collapsing categories. Forgiveness removes debt. It does not remove discernment. Reconciliation rebuilds trust. It does not eliminate structure. Access must be earned through consistency, not emotion. Jesus demonstrated this repeatedly. After his resurrection, he forgave Peter, but Peter was restored through process, not sentiment. There were conversations, there was reaffirmation, there was responsibility. Grace did not bypass reality. Now consider how most people operate. They feel guilty for setting limits. They apologize for boundaries. They explain themselves endlessly. This reveals something deeper. They believe love must be proven through self-exposure. Jesus never proved love by abandoning himself. He proved love by remaining aligned with truth. Now we must confront why this distinction is so difficult to accept. Because many people confuse boundaries with punishment. They believe distance equals rejection. But Jesus used distance as protection, not retaliation. When he walked away from hostile crowds, he was not punishing them, he was preserving mission. When he refused to engage with manipulative questioning, he was not being cold, he was being clear. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. Walls isolate, filters protect. Jesus filtered constantly. Now let us examine the generational pattern that keeps repeating. Many people grew up in environments where access was chaotic. Emotional boundaries were unclear. Silence was used as punishment. Affection was conditional. Conflict was avoided or explosive. From these environments, two coping styles usually emerge. One becomes overly available, hoping to secure connection through accommodation. The other becomes rigidly unavailable, protecting themselves through withdrawal. Both are reactions, neither is governance. Jesus modeled a third way. He was selectively available, intentionally present, discernment-driven in access. This allowed him to love without being consumed. Now consider how relationships decay when this structure is missing. When availability is demanded without consent, resentment forms. When presence is expected without respect, detachment follows. When access is granted without trust, betrayal becomes inevitable. Most people do not destroy relationships through cruelty. They destroy them through confusion. Jesus addressed confusion with clarity. Now we must confront a belief that keeps many people trapped. If I set limits, I will lose people. Sometimes this is true, but Jesus accepted that reality. He never compromised truth to preserve attachment. This does not mean he was indifferent to loss. It means he refused to build relationships on distortion. Relationships built on distortion always collapse. Now observe something subtle. Many people say they want peace, but they actually want predictability. Peace comes from alignment. Predictability comes from control. Jesus offered peace, not control. This is why people felt safe with him even when he challenged them. Safety does not come from appeasement, it comes from consistency. Jesus was consistent. You always knew where he stood. This brings us to another overlooked mechanism. Consistency creates trust more than intensity. Many relationships begin intensely and collapse quickly because intensity was mistaken for alignment. Jesus never rushed intimacy. He allowed trust to grow through repeated truth. Now consider how this applies to your life. Who has access to your thoughts? Who shapes your self-perception? Who influences your decisions? Access answers these questions. If you grant access to people who are inconsistent, critical, or manipulative, your internal environment becomes unstable. Jesus protected his internal environment fiercely, not through hardness, through clarity. Now let us confront the fear that often surfaces here. But what if I forgive and set boundaries, and the other person never changes? Then reconciliation may not occur. Jesus accepted this outcome. Forgiveness frees you. Reconciliation requires two willing participants. Access is not an entitlement. This is why Jesus said, "Do not throw your pearls before swine." Matthew 7:6. This is not insult. It is discernment. Some truths are wasted in environments that cannot honor them. This statement alone dismantles the myth that love means unlimited access. Jesus valued wisdom over emotional display. Now we must address the final internal resistance. Many people fear that without emotional leverage, guilt, obligation, over-explaining, relationships will fall apart. What they fear is losing control. Jesus never controlled relationships. He invited alignment, and many refused. He let them go. This is one of the most mature relational acts possible. Now we arrive at a critical realization. You cannot sustain healthy relationships without tolerating the possibility of loss. Clinging to people at the cost of truth always leads to erosion. Jesus understood that some losses protect future health. Now observe how this integrates with forgiveness. Forgiveness releases the past. Boundaries protect the present. Discernment shapes the future. When these work together, cycles break. When they are confused, cycles repeat. This is why so many people forgive repeatedly but never experience change. They forgive but keep granting the same access to the same behavior. Jesus never did this. He observed fruit. A tree is known by its fruit. Matthew 7:16. Not by intentions, not by apologies, by patterns. Patterns determine access. This is not cruelty, it is wisdom. Now let us expose the final illusion. Many people believe Jesus' teachings are unrealistic for modern relationships. But the truth is the opposite. Modern relationships are failing precisely because these teachings are ignored. People chase emotional comfort instead of truth. They avoid clarity to preserve illusion. They confuse love with tolerance of dysfunction. Jesus dismantled all of this. He offered a way to love without self-erasure. Now the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of relational environment are you creating? One where people must guess? One where silence replaces truth? One where guilt substitutes for agreement? Or one where words are clear, boundaries are honored, and forgiveness is real? Jesus did not change relationships by fixing people. He changed them by changing systems, systems of speech, systems of access, systems of truth. And now we are approaching the final expansion. In the next part, we will confront the most uncomfortable layer of all: why many people secretly resist healing, and how identity attached to pain keeps relational cycles alive, even when knowledge is present. This is where transformation either completes or stalls.